dumb it down a little bit for a few minutes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to speak to you today. I want to talk about cyber crime. And I want to pull cyber crime away from the broader cyber security discussion because I think it's important that the real reason I want to do it is because cyber crime requires a different approach than just the preventative hardening of cybersecurity systems. Cyber crime is complicated by the huge privacy issues that attach, complicated by encryption issues, trying to translate really technically complex pieces of information into cogent and coherent evidence. And we're not that far ahead in terms of preparing ourselves to attack cybercrime, to overlay a criminal justice response to those who would exploit cyber for criminal reasons. So the last guy in the world you want to hear from on a technical briefing is me, frankly, on the internet. And I'm just going to sort of cover quickly what I think I understand the internet to be, which is essentially three layers. The surface layer, which has all of the browsers and the social media platforms that we use. The deep web, which in some estimates has between 90 and 96% of the information that's restricted. That is really all of your information, the RCMP's information. That's the chunk of the web. And then there's the dark web, I think that people have heard about, where you can pretty well do anything and transact anything. You require a little bit of technical sort of sophistication, but that's all readily available to get access into the web, into the dark web. And you can sell drugs and buy drugs. You can buy identities. You can buy credit cards. You can have people killed. You can do any number of things that you want to have done through the dark web. The web also is constructed of a really elaborate technical architecture. Servers and clouds and devices. And while that has to be known in order to bring your cyber criminal response, it doesn't have to be known by me or you this morning, and thank God, because I'm not going to go into that. But in the result, you get this fantastic opportunity for mankind. Fantastic advances in terms of communication, in terms of education, in terms of commerce. And it's a fantastically fertile ground as well for criminality. There's nothing new under the sun, really. I mean, when we saw banditry flourish as the Romans pushed out roads into the world as it then was, so too is criminality recognizing the opportunities, and they are equally boundless on the information superhighway. So, what is it about the web, what is it about the internet that makes it attractive to criminals? In a word, in my word, it's artificial. It's a community, it's a neighborhood that is really artificial. And in this neighborhood, if you want to wear a mask while you transact whatever you're transacting, please do. If you want to have a fake name, please do. In fact, you're encouraged to make up names on the internet. You can drive around in a car that has no license plate. You can live in a house that doesn't have an address, on a street that has no name. And more importantly, and perhaps critically, you can have information, evidence in your house that even if a judicially authorized instrument is given to the police to go get that, you can conceal it from the police, largely without consequence here in Canada. So the neighborhood is very attractive, and the crooks are moving in. And, you know, it's a problem. Cybercrime is a problem. It's growing. It's not, the sky isn't falling just yet. And as my old partner used to say when I would say, well, you know, we're doing better every day, he'd say, well, I can hardly wait for tomorrow. The response that the government and the RCMP and other agencies have been sort of typical large government institution responses. I mean, you don't want to have, it started at 20 minutes, didn't it? Okay, I was confused. I thought I'd just started. you're not a government institution worth your salt unless you have a really complex strategy and action plan with which to tackle it. And I make fun of that, but really in the last couple of years, the Government of Canada and the RCMP have developed such things. They're on the web, they're available to be seen. The Government of Canada's action plan really consists of a preventative approach to hardening the government's systems, to engaging with key and vital industry in Canada to protect them and to generally educate Canadians. It has as a feature, too, an outreach initiative to try and engage and partner with private industry. Similarly, the RCMP's has a similar plan. But ours is focused less on prevention, although education is very important. Ours is focused on an investigative capacity building and changing some of the systems that we have in our organization to be able to hire the right kind of people, to have the right kind of tools, to have the capacity to be able to tackle this. We classify cybercrime in two sort of categories. The first is, standard, conventional, traditional criminality enhanced and perfected and executed through the web. We call that cyber as an instrument. And some examples of that would be child sexual exploitation, a hideous kind of crime which has traditionally always occupied a very small corner of the room we call our society. Pushed off, police handle it, nobody really wants to know about it, nobody really wants to hear too much about it, but that it's in hand. Well, the internet and its characteristics have provided a boon to that sort of criminality, because the subculture within these individuals, because there is a sense of community among them, is thriving on the ability to be able to exchange tips and best practices and to, most importantly, exchange photographs, because that's the currency of their acts. The rarity, the exclusiveness of a photo is what gives them excitement. And that's why you hear when there's arrests and searches, they pull 50, 60,000 photos out of an offender's house. You have to remember that each one of those individuals, each one of those pictures represents a victim. And so you've got this X equals Y growth curve in child sexual exploitation. Another example of cyber as an instrument would be in the terrorism business. A couple years ago, almost 2 years ago, there was a young fellow named Aaron Driver who was a Canadian radicalized to the ISIS objectives. And try though we may to bring him before the courts and charge him, we weren't successful. We were successful at getting a peace bond on him. And he moved to Southern Ontario and took up residence and didn't abide by the conditions of his peace bond, continued to engage in computer cyber activity. And one fateful day, a couple years ago, we had to rush a response team to an area of Southern Ontario because we learned from the FBI was just going out to, with a bomb strapped to his chest, to go to a highly populated, densely populated area of Southern Ontario and explode it. Now, the rub here is that we had been working him, and we had been surveilling him, and other agencies had been surveilling him. And he was able to exchange all of this information and get all of the information from the web without us knowing about it. And thank God that the FBI had an undercover agent talking with him, because that's how we learned that he was going to set this bomb off. But he was encrypting, and he was on these social media sites that were encrypted and incapable of being penetrated by the police to get in front of him. So we were lucky there. But illustrations of cyber as an instrument. Cyber as a target is the other sort of class of crime that we look at, where the information in the deep web is being targeted either by another state to go get, well, to maybe influence an election, to go and get that information and do something with it. Maybe interrupt or at least monitor the communications network of leaders of countries. Denial of service attacks, exploitation of vulnerabilities. And a couple years ago, the CRA had a vulnerability on their public portal, and quickly had to shut down around tax time, and it was a big brouhaha. But then all of a sudden somebody said, okay, well, shouldn't you be doing something about that? Shouldn't you go and try and find the person that did that? And we were able to do that, luckily through the use of information that other agencies in the government were able to give us, and we got a search warrant. We arrested the young guy, and fortunately he wasn't selling the information, but he was able to extract and exfiltrate maybe 1,000 identities and SIN numbers. But we were lucky there too. He, 2 years later, got a conditional sentence because he wasn't selling it. He was just, as his lawyer said, the only reason he did it, my lord, is because he could. And he's a good boy, and he actually is a good boy, so don't get me wrong. But it focuses the mind on what the challenges are in terms of how we're going to respond as a nation to what is largely misunderstood as a threat. So back to what the Government of Canada, less about what the Government of Canada is doing and more about what the RCMP was doing and is doing. We're trying to sort of reinvent how we approach criminality on the web. And so we will be looking for intelligence, we'll be looking to prioritize and weigh respective threats. The most exciting and potentially helpful initiative is one that calls for a massive undercover buildup in terms of our ability to penetrate some of these exchanges, because if we can't monitor and intercept the communications and gather the evidence that we need, then we should do as the FBI did in that driver case and be able to be out there. Then that's fraught with all sorts of public policy questions and concerns, and in fact, blue on blue, you know, having undercover cops investigate undercover cops as they dance around nothing, that can be confusing, but it's a very hopeful sign. So it sounds like, you know, things are on the move in this sort of infancy of response to cybercrime. We don't have a lot of big successes that we can point to. And the reason I think that we don't is because of a couple of really intractable situations, problems, and they are privacy issues. And just like I'm the last guy you want to hear a technical briefing on the internet from, you probably don't want to take too much advice from a cop or an ex-cop on privacy matters. But therein lies a bit of the rub. The whole idea of our criminal justice system is predicated on some sort of basic legal principles. That if we can establish to a reasonable standard in Canada, a reasonable grounds, in probable cause in the United States, then we ought to be able to go and get things and get evidence and execute search warrants and so on. And that is really challenging us here presently in Canada, because governments come up against this, choose my words, perverse sort of misplaced distrust of police and privacy matters. And there's not a government, not this government, not the previous government, not the next government, that will really be able to sort of weigh into this thing and walk the balance between privacy and freedom and reasonable tools for the police to be able to do their investigations. When the government was a year ago looking at whether or not they were going to examine, and they did examine, whether they're going to change any laws with respect to lawful access, I took a position to say that we needed to, at the very least, have warrantless access to customer name and address information. Back to that neighborhood where people are driving around in invisible cars with houses with no numbers or addresses. Because it's very challenging in some of these criminal investigations, particularly when they're unfolding quickly, and it's not terribly unreasonable to be able to want to put an IP address to a physical location. And that has really tied the hands of Canadian lawmakers and authorities, largely in the Western world. I've maintained that Canadians have much more to fear in terms of privacy concerns from commerce and industry than they do from the police. And we need only look at the recent Facebook issues to get some sort of reassurance that that may be starting to change. But I think now it's that they don't trust anybody, and the police included. You know, it's fascinating that Mark Zuckerberg can get up and say, well, you know, maybe it is time that we had some regulation. Maybe it is time that we looked at regulating some aspects of the internet. And, you know, the response is, oh, yeah, we ought to think about that. Sure, maybe. But if you get a cop or a senior cop or an ex-cop to stand up and say, hey, maybe we ought to think about regulating some aspects of the internet, and you get, oh, shut up, you jackbooted brown shirt. That's all the advice we'll take from you. And so what we learn from that, what you can take away from that, is that the conversation has not been had properly. And maybe what I take away from that is the cops got to stay out of it. But I think industry, as they wrestle with this sort of vastly, expanding world that is the World Wide Web and all of the fascinating opportunities that it presents, you need to have some element of assessment of criminality, of potential for criminality, of exploitation to criminality. The challenge is having that conversation in a way that brings the judgments out of distrust of the state with respect to this privacy information. Where I want to sort of end on is the public-private collaboration. That is, first of all, having, when I met with Justin and Damien to assess whether or not I would be a good fit to come and speak with you, what turned it was I said, well, you got an ex-crook coming tomorrow, I understand, so you got to have an ex-cop. The public-private collaboration, just like police offering advice in respect of privacy, is a challenge, because that privacy, I was going to use the word perversion, that's not right. The privacy misunderstanding is clouding the ability of law enforcement to work credibly with private industry. I'm going to give you an example without naming the Canadian company, but we went and reached out to a Canadian company to work on some really challenging technical issues. And we have, or we did, or I used to, have quite a technical ability within the National Police Force to unpack some of these technical gizmos and get to understand how they work. But we came up against it on a series of mob murders that were happening, and we were incapable of doing anything about it. And this company rolled up their sleeves and said, yeah, we'll help. And it was all blue skies and butterflies until the trial happened and disclosure took place. And when disclosure took place, then there was a recognition, hey, what are these guys doing in bed with the police? This is no good. And so there was a reputational risk to that company, and arguably a business risk for them to be able to engage with the police. And my question was, when did catching murderers, fall out of grace? When did Canadians helping law enforcement bring solutions to criminal threats? When did that become unpopular? But it wasn't that. It was the idea that this information machine is being compromised and infiltrated by the deep state, I guess. Another quick example before I absolutely stop talking is my friend Jim Comey in the United States got into a terrible bun fight with the head of Apple over whether or not they would help them open up a mobile phone that was used in the terrorism attacks in California a couple years ago. And it wasn't that they were taking sort of ideological, well, although the FBI was, but I think Apple was just concerned properly of the reputational risk that would attach and go to the confidence that people have in their gizmos. Lesson is we need to work on that conversation. We need to have public and private engagement in order to succeed in this really complex area. And we are starting to make some headway. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for hearing me out, and I will conclude my remarks.